At 7:15 at the Tone, here's Morning Edition, Section 3.
News around the world with Don Gardner, brought to you by Winston Cigarettes. Changing to a filter cigarette? Change to Winston. Winston tastes good, like a cigarette should. Now here is Don Gardner.
Good morning from ABC News, New York. The Russians have finally answered a U.S. protest note of more than 2 weeks ago concerning blockades on the Berlin Autobahn. As expected, the Soviets turned down the protest, said they'll continue to make the rules on the Autobahn, and the Russians accused the U.S. of artificially provoking the Autobahn incidents. President Kennedy's job in Texas to patch up the Democratic Party. The job in its second day, 3 more speeches on tap: Fort Worth, Dallas, Austin. ABC microphones are with the president and on hand last evening in San Antonio when President Kennedy spoke of success in our space program.
Whatever the difficulties, they will be overcome. Whatever the hazards, they must be guarded against. I think the United States should be a leader. A country as rich and powerful as this, which bears so many burdens and responsibilities, which has so many opportunities, should be second to none.
The First Lady is also along on this Texas trip, and from all reports, she's making quite a hit with the Texans. More news in just a moment.
Thinking of changing to a filter cigarette?
Well, if you're thinking of changing to a filter cigarette, make it Winston. Change into a filter cigarette. Change to Winston. Because Winston tastes good like a cigarette should.
Change to America's largest selling filter cigarette, Winston.
No truer words ever spoken or sung. They tell you why, of all filter cigarettes, Winston is America's largest selling by far. Smoke Winston. Now back to the news.
The Russian diplomatic exodus from the Congo is underway. One Russian diplomat arrived in Brussels this morning. Reportedly, he was barefoot. The Congolese hustled the Russian out of the country so fast he didn't have time to get all his clothing. The Congo is expelling the entire Russian mission. The CIA will be downgraded in the fight against communists in South Vietnam. This exclusive report from ABC's John Scally after the Vietnam strategy meetings in Honolulu. Scally says the step is being taken because the Central Intelligence Agency worked perhaps too closely with the deposed ZM regime. Important elections in Japan, but no surprises. The report from Ray Falk, ABC Tokyo.
Japan's conservative Liberal Democrats have won a clear majority in the National Diet elections and thus remain in charge of the government for the next 4 years. The Conservatives did a little worse than predicted. The left a little better than expected. The election was the dullest in Japan's recent history, with a record low of only 60% voting in Tokyo. There will be no changes in the government's pro-Western and cautious China policy. But Prime Minister Ikeda will have a tougher time within his own party. Ray Falk, ABC, Tokyo.
With just a few scattered no votes, the Ecumenical Council today approved its first completed schema, voting overwhelming endorsement for the replacement of Latin by modern languages in much of Roman Catholic worship. ABC on hand at Columbia University last night in New York as former President Eisenhower spoke of the necessity for spiritual strength if a nation is to be great. And then Mr. Eisenhower talked about the place of religion or prayer in schools.
We have a Supreme Court decision that in our great public system, we can make no mention of religion, or at least we cannot utter certain prayers. If for no other reason, the privately endowed and supported institution of education deserves our support, it would be because you are not so hampered and restricted.
And former President Eisenhower was awarded the Alexander Hamilton Medal at Columbia. At Uvalde, Texas, birthday number 95 for John Nance Garner, a vice president under FDR. Now, a message from our sponsor.
Hey, Tim, I got my card. Give you a lift home?
Swell. I'm tired. Had a nagging backache lately.
That can get you down.
And with the sleepless nights that go with it, I feel dragged out.
Last year, my dad was bothered by backache, but he found grand relief. Maybe you could, too.
How?
Try Doan's Pills.
Good advice. That's Doan's Pills, an analgesic and mild diuretic to the kidneys. Nagging backache, also headache, dizziness, and muscular aches and pains may come on with overexertion, emotional upsets, or everyday stress and strain. Doan's pain-relieving action is often the answer, and they also offer mild diuretic action through the kidneys. So if nagging backache is making you feel worn out, tired, and miserable with restless, sleepless nights, don't wait. Try Doan's Pills, used successfully by millions for over 60 years. See if they don't bring you the same welcome relief. Get Doan's Pills today. For convenience, buy Doan's large size.
This is News Around the World. Back to Don Gardner after a pause for station identification.
This is 570 WBAP in Fort Worth. Radio Refined. The time, 7:21.
And there are more reports from Berlin, Moscow, Washington, Houston, New York City, and ABC microphones and reporters were on the scene to catch the voices of people making news as News Around the World continues.
There's now some doubt as to who will fill the foreign aid vacuum in Cambodia following Prince Sihanouk's renunciation of the dollar stream from Washington. It had been thought the Cambodian leader would ask Red China and Russia to fill the gap, but Sihanouk last night termed communist aid particularly dangerous and hinted that he may turn now to France. A search for the missing U-2 pilot continues even as the Navy plans to raise the wreckage of his plane from the Gulf of Mexico. There has still been no official announcement of the plane's mission, presumed to have been reconnaissance over Cuba. The wreckage of the U-2 was located in 100 feet of water yesterday in the Gulf near Key West, Florida. The Soviet Union has answered the American protest regarding the incidents on the Autobahn. A report now from Ben Lacey, ABC, Berlin.
The Allied garrisons here emphatically reject the Russian version of what happened on the Berlin Autobahn early this month. Officials declared again that the American, British, and French convoys did not dismount, and they were cleared on their terms. American officials vigorously deny the Soviet claim that the United States convoy tried to change clearance procedures but gave up when it wouldn't work. Authorities say the Russian statement that the British and French convoys cleared without conflict is correct because the Soviets did not choose to detain these two movements when they refused to dismount. Ben Lacey, ABC, Berlin.
Now, the case for the Soviets spelled out last night by Radio Moscow.
The Foreign Ministry notes that if the United States were not interested in causing incidents like the one at the Marienborn control post, it had only to issue the appropriate instructions to its military representatives without allowing situations to arise when any irresponsible American officer could provoke dangerous incidents. The Soviet Union expects the United States to take steps to end the regrettable deportment of its military personnel.
The way Radio Moscow sees it, it's all our fault. The investigation into the affairs of Bobby Baker, the former secretary to the Democratic majority in the Senate, continues, and we get the latest from Pete Clapper, ABC, Washington.
The Bobby Baker case continues to titillate Washington, probably a good deal more than the rest of the country. Today's big news is that the former Senate Majority Secretary apparently remains unworried. He's said to be sore at news stories about him, but cocksure he won't be nabbed for tax evasion. He's quoted as saying that when things unravel, he'll be okay. The unraveling, however, proceeds uncommonly slowly. Today, the Senate probe of conflict of interest charges against Baker will follow up new leads provided yesterday by Mrs. Trudy Novak. She testified privately about financial deals involving her late husband and Baker. Pete Clapper, ABC, Washington.
And that's the report from Capitol Hill on News Around the World.
Drive out today, Arlington Way, for a 10-minute trip down the Arlington Strip.
1,000 cars in half a mile,
and a silver wheel deal that's really worthwhile. Arlington, Arlington,
Arlington,
Arlington Auto Aisle.
Have you seen the whole new car lineup for 1964? Now is the time to take a short drive out Arlington Way, where you can view and compare all the new cars at the easy-to-shop Arlington Auto Aisle. Not only can you save money with an exclusive silver wheel deal, but you can compare the features of the 1964 models without wandering from dealership to distant dealership. Over 1,000 cars from which to choose. Drive out today to Bob Cook Ford, Luke Pontiac Rambler, Nowell Dodge Renault, Vandergrift Buick, Vandergrift Chevrolet, and Butts Oldsmobile Cadillac.
Arlington, 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 Arlington Auto Aisle.
At 25 minutes past 7, back to News Around the World.
Now, President Kennedy's predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, at Columbia University last night, spoke of American leadership.
Our nation, to be the leader, but it must be spiritually strong, or it will never have in the long run, a great and expanding economy and the necessary military strength until the world has been led into paths of peace.
And in Washington, General Eisenhower's Republican colleague, Indiana Congressman Charles Halleck, also had some comment on American leadership.
During the 1960 presidential campaign, Mr. Kennedy filled the airwaves with what he called, quote, the need for strong leadership, the need to go forward with vigor. If we examine President Kennedy's handling of his legislative programs for his first 3 years, his 1960 campaign cries are more applicable today than 3 years ago.